So thanks again, as I said, for joining us today. This session today on breaking stereotypes, navigating misogyny with young men, is the first of 4 youth work insight sessions that we're running this year with a focus on gender. So youth work insight sessions are an opportunity for us at the NYA to convene a panel of really exciting experts in the field in topics that are useful to us as people that work with young people, to hear about up-to-date research, insight and practice that can help us and shape the work that we do specifically with young people. So we thought it'd be useful to give you a bit of a context as for why we chose this topic to begin with. One of the things that we get a lot of contact from youth work practitioners about at the moment is challenges with working with young people around ideas of misogyny. So young people are increasingly exposed to different ideology, different role models, different stereotypes and different cultures that's starting to influence and inform who they are and how they operate within the world. And for some young people, this has been a little bit of a challenge. We're hearing lots from youth workers on the impact of specific cultural influences. For example, we would expect most people have probably seen what's happened with Andrew Tate and people like that, and the relationship for some young men with him in a negative way, but also for some young men with him and his ideology in what can be a positive way. And I guess the most important thing that we hear is that youth workers are feeling a little bit uncomfortable or uncertain or unsure about how to engage with this as a topic with young people. So that's what this session is about. This session is about bringing together people who have got lots of experience or knowledge about this as a topic and about working with young men around their identity. And we're going to have the opportunity to listen to and learn from them and all their years of experience. And hopefully that'll be something for all of us to take away from today's session. So to begin with, I'm going to introduce you to our panel and give them a chance to introduce themselves to you and tell you a little bit about their work. And then we're going to work through a series of themes where we'll pose some questions and we'll bring some questions from you to the panel. So our panel today is exceptional. We have got Ben Hurst, Louise Milani, Pete Harris and Michael McKenna. And I'm going to come to each of them in turn to give you a quick introduction to who they are, what it is they do, and a little bit of a little snapshot of what they might be bringing to you today. So without further ado, Louise, can I come to you, please, for a quick intro?
You can. Thank you very much, Abby. And thank you for the invitation to join you today. And hello to everybody that's on Zoom, who we can't see, but we know you're there. I'm Louise Milani. I work at the University of Nottingham. I'm a professor in sociolinguistics and I'm based in the School of English. And I look at language and linguistics, particularly around inequalities. And since 2016, I've worked with Nottingham Women's Group, with the local community, with Nottinghamshire Police, looking at misogyny, hate crime. So in 2016, Nottinghamshire was the first police force in the country to bring in misogyny as a hate crime. And we've worked with them and done research evaluations along the way. As part of that, we've worked with extensive groups of young men, boys, also range of different age groups, looking at how misogyny can be addressed. Okay.
Thanks, Louise. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that, and particularly about, Nottingham as a bit of a flagship place for some of this sort of like contemporary ideas. That's brilliant. Ben, can we come to you next, please?
Of course you can. Of course you can. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Hurst. Introductions are horrible. They're the worst. They're like so difficult to figure out what you're supposed to say. I am the director of facilitation at an organization called Beyond Equality. Beyond Equality is a gender equity organization that works across schools, universities, corporate spaces, engaging men and boys in gender equality conversations through the lens of masculinity. So the easiest way, like in the elevator pitch, I always describe it as deconstructing and reconstructing masculinity, but like the participants do it for themselves. So it's pretty cool work. This is actually like a really trippy experience for me with the youth agency. I think because I dropped out of my first year of youth and community development at university because I couldn't. I was done. I was finished with education. But I'm really happy to be here. Really excited to chat more with all of you and to hear from especially the other panelists.
Ben, thank you. And do you know what's really important about what you said about professional education is that as the MYA, we're the professional home for youth work, which includes everybody from, I always talk about karate grandma, you know, somebody that just wants to do good community work because of love and care, as opposed to as a professional career. So I'm really glad that you said that, because then it's embracing everybody who might be on this call, not just those of us who decided to go to professional qualifications. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Pete, can we come to you?
Hi, my name's Pete Harris. I'm an ex-youth worker. I was a street-based youth worker for about 20 years. I was chair of the Federation for Detached Youth Work a long time ago. I now teach at Birmingham Newman University. I'm a reader in criminology and youth studies. I've done my PhD was in working with young men or older men who were working with some younger men who were involved in violence. And I've recently been working with a colleague, Harriet Cutler, on a gender-based abuse and violence project in a school, which I'll be able to talk about later, working with 14-year-old young men on the issue of gender-based abuse and violence.
Pete, that's really useful. Thank you. Really helpful. I'm sure lots of people will be particularly interested to connect with your work after this session, thinking about how important detached is, particularly at the moment. Also, side note, very interesting campaign work happening in Birmingham in relation to the youth service. So do please have a look at that if you're not aware of it. And last but absolutely not least, can we come to you, Michael, for a quick intro?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Michael McKenna. I work for Youth Action Northern Ireland. We're a regional volunteer youth organisation, membership-based charity, and we work with young people aged 14 to 25 in local communities, right throughout sort of the north of Ireland, to improve their challenging inequalities and to improve their life chances of both young people and the communities. The first piece of work with young men that I sort of specifically done was back in 1983. Now, back when I'm looking back then, I didn't think it was through a gender lens, but on reflection, it was before. And it's great to hear, that Pete there has got his link with Birmingham, because I jumped across the water then in '94 to study youth and community work in West Hill College. So I studied my youth and community work degree there. So I've been working from Youth Action since 1989, but since 2004. I was the senior leader responsible for our work with young men. And our work with young men is primarily about working with young men, exploring masculinity and masculinities, the impact that has on their lives, growing up in which still is a post-conflict society, even though we're still 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. A lot of these issues within local communities are still very prevalent and still there an impact on their lives. So looking forward to the chats today and to learn from the other panelists and everybody, all the other people that's in the webinar here as well. So looking forward to it.
Thanks ever so, Michael. That was really, really interesting insight. And I guess there might be a lot for people to learn as well from you in relation to what you were talking about sort of post-conflict societies. Lots of us might be working with young people who have come to the UK, for example, fleeing violence and fleeing conflict. So there's definitely some interesting things for us to learn from you in that. Okay, so you've heard from the panel. Just a quick refresh, because we've had quite a few more people enter the room since we started. If people can keep their cameras off and on mute, pop any questions you've got into the chat and our colleagues will pick it up. And we're recording this session, just to reiterate that. Okay, so let's move straight on to the topic at hand. Zaina, next slide, please. Okay, so we're thinking about the bigger picture. We're going to start by thinking about the social picture and the world that young people find themselves in today. So what are we talking about when we're talking about misogyny? So we're going to start thinking about culture and community, society, the settings that our young people and us as workers find ourselves in, and policy. We're going to have a bit of a chance to think about cultural norms and socialization and how we can disrupt those in a way that's really positive. But to start, I think it would be really helpful if we could start by thinking about terminology and what some of the language that we might be hearing from young people or using within this context and within this session together. So Louise, given your background and given what you talked about at the start, it'd be great if we could start with you. Could you give us some definitions here? What are we talking about when we talk about misogyny, and any other terminology that might be useful for colleagues?
So I think that the dictionary-based definition of misogyny is around hatred or dislike or prejudice towards women. So there's a kind of accepted view that misogyny is all about hate. And if you look it up in the dictionary, it is much broader than that. And there is that focus on dislike and prejudice that comes through as well, particularly from the Oxford English Dictionary, which traces it back through time. When we started working in Nottingham, one of the things that we were looking at assessing was whether people understood what the term misogyny meant, whether they knew exactly what it was referring to, how widely was it used in general conversation. We found some really interesting findings that a lot of people said they didn't really know what it was. They had to Google it. This is people that included teachers, people that had got degrees. Nobody was entirely sure exactly what it was. This was back in 2018, and more recent surveys have shown that the use of misogyny as a term has really increased, particularly in the media since then. So we're probably in a slightly different place now. But what we were really interested in looking at was, if the police or the government is coming up with a policy, the general public needs to be able to understand what it is and needs to be able to interpret it and pinpoint exactly what it is that we're talking about. That's fundamentally important. So some of the other terms that we played around with, and we had numerous discussions with the Law Commission about this when they were conducting their review of hate crime, is what should this be called? What is it that we're actually talking about here? Is it gender-based violence? The term misogyny, one of the questions that we quite often got asked, particularly by members of the press, was, what about misandry? What about men? Men are missing from this equation. Why is that? You know, what's going on in this space? The statistics, when you look at them, show that the kind of violence that we're talking about here, whether it's physical or verbal, women are, in our own work, we're 88% more likely to experience it than men. But of course, having a catch-all term and talking about this more holistically has real significant benefits. So some of the other terms that we talked about and that we discussed with the Law Commission was around, is this sex-based? Is it gender-based? Is it sex hostile? Is it sex or perceived sex that we're talking about here in this particular space? And of course, it's important not to get too caught up by the terminology, though it is fundamentally important, as I've said, that everybody who's using the term, when we're teaching the term, you know, that everybody can understand exactly what it is. So it's important not to fall down a rabbit hole and go, what is this that we're actually dealing with? But that clarity of information there is really very, very important. It's quite fundamentally important. And in the end, the Law Commission moved away from the idea of misogyny as a hate crime and moved more towards thinking about public sexual harassment and crime in that kind of public-based space, and freeing it up from any kind of gender-based label. So that's kind of history and where we're at this precise moment in time. But as I've said, things are changing, and the Oxford English Dictionary in particular monitors how words change over time. So its usage has increased across the board.
I think that's really helpful, Louise. And I guess it's interesting to think about, like, who identifies with the term, who uses the term, and who recognises it. Because I guess for a lot of us, we might be comfortable with the language, but actually, is it something that young people are using? What does it feel like in young people's words? How relevant is it to young people in their setting and context? And Michael, I think I'd be quite interested to hear your perspective on this, working very specifically around sort of masculinity and identity in young men.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. So I suppose our work and our approach to the work with young men is directly sort of working with them to help themselves learn and develop strategies for themselves, where they're actually exploring masculinity and masculinities and what it means to be male sort of growing up today. Because part of it for us is that, like, what we are finding, you know, with young men is that they're coming across, there's these notions of these like restrictive masculinities, outdated notions of commandments of masculinities about what it means to be male. You have to be big, you have to be strong, you have to be heterosexual, brave, courageous, all these sort of things that are part of the conversation with young men. And while they're very vitally important, how young men manifest these sometimes isn't healthy. It isn't good, and how they think that they have to behave in relation to this. So part of our work is what we do with young men is we flip these in our head and try to get them to, you know, to look at the alternatives, you know, to that as well. So that, you know, it's brave and courageous, you know, to speak about how you're feeling. It's okay to admit that you're wrong, that you don't know. You know, if young men are behaving in a certain way or in a certain fashion, you know, even by asking them, you know, how's that making you feel? A lot of the times that, you know, they don't know. When we work with young men, we would work with young men there, in the past, lots of different sort of circumstances. Young men, a lot of these young men that we work with are in youth groups, you know, so they come from a broad sort of range of backgrounds in the local communities, and but there's some other young men that we're engaging, you know, that would come from, you know, to be engaging with the likes of the Youth Justice Agency, for example. And when we talk to the young men about, you know, about their behaviour and about, you know, why they got into certain situations, a lot of the times they tell us that they've never been asked that before. They're always told, you know, about why they act like that. They've never actually been asked themselves, you know, what made you do that? What made you act like that in relation to maybe violence or lashing out or getting involved in you know, in risk-taking behaviour. So part of the conversation and part of the work that we need to do with young men is actually take it into their sphere. It's actually begin to talk about it, you know, in their lives as young men. What is the impact, you know, of these issues, you know, on their lives? But it's also, you know, particularly, you know, for the workers, and particularly for male workers. Now, and I don't apologise for saying this either, is that male workers need to grasp this nettle as well and start to look at themselves and look at their own issues and begin to think about, well, you know, with your engagement with young men, are you mirroring or, you know, is your behaviour role model them negative stereotypical, you know, young men that's in the lives of young men? So over here in the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland, you know, in a lot of communities, young men would look up to men that would have been in paramilitary organisations. So that's seen as that role model, you know, within the community. Why is that? Because they have power. You know, they're the defender of their community. They're sticking up for their community against the threat, you know, from the other side. They have money, they have respect. People look up to them. You know, but we want to get young men to actually look at, well, what other men is in your local communities? You know, is there other men there that you look up to? What about the sports coach? What about the man that, you know, drives the bus? What about the person that's standing on the lollipop and having people cross, you know, the road? What other men are there that they can begin to look out, that actually step away from these notions about what it means to be male as well? So the challenge about this work is, yeah, it's actually getting them doing it with, you know, with young men, but it's also for workers to begin to think about, well, what am I doing? How am I having these conversations, you know, with young men? And particularly for male youth workers, I would say, like, if you're having conversations with young men and you don't know what the answer, you don't know the right, is say to the young man, you know, actually, I don't know. I actually don't know how that makes me feel. Or I don't know. I've never been asked that before, but, you know, I'll go away and think about it. And I'll come back next week or the next time you see us. I'll have thought a wee bit more about it. I'll look into it and I'll come back with a wee answer and we'll open up part of the conversation. So part of it as well is, you know, is working safely with young men and expect, you know, giving a wee bit of yourself, you know, as well, and letting young men see that vulnerability that you have, you know, as a man as well, and part of that, they're, you know, part of that conversation.
I think that's really valuable, and we're definitely going to come back to that idea about workers and roles and relationships and role models a bit later, because I know I had a really interesting conversation with Pete about that too. But I think one of the interesting things about what you said was about some of the language and the words that you were using about, like, vulnerability and situating the way that we have conversations with young people within the language that they understand and within things that are meaningful to them. I guess one of the things that I see in some of the work that I do is there's different understandings and contexts for language. So there's this interesting thing at the moment about like identity and identity politics, and how do we talk about being a man, and how do we talk about being a woman, and how do we talk about gender. And I think there's some really interesting things for us to explore in relation to that in this topic. But Pete or Ben, whoever wants to unmute, do you have anything that you'd like to add about sort of terminology and context for this?
I'll save my thunder for that other conversation and let Ben take that one.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Pete. I thought that what both of you guys were saying was so interesting there. And I really do agree, Abby, that like we fall into this trap of like using buzzwords and using terms without like defining what they mean for each other. And I think actually so much of like meaning is made in community, right? So like I don't know whether the definitions from the top necessarily matter or have much impact in the rooms that we're in. But I do find that like with young people, the word misogyny is so loaded, right? Like my partner's daughter is 21. So for like the last 5 years, I've listened to her talk about misogyny and men and like figure out what she thinks and figure out her worldview around all of that kind of stuff. And I remember starting out in this like area of work and doing a lot of like anti-racist practice work and coming to terms with like the fact that if I think about like the word racism, for example, like what I'd been taught in school was racism was like being horrible to somebody because of the color of their skin. So in my mind, that was like something anybody could do to anybody else. And it was like really easy. And it was basically an us and them situation. You're either a good person or you're a bad person. Whereas like, I think especially since working for Beyond Equality, like the approach that we take to all of these issues is we come at all of like the terminology and the words with an intersectional feminist framework, which is really interesting, just in terms of like understanding what words mean and how we're communicating those meanings to other people. So now, whereas for me, once upon a time, misogyny would have been hating women or being horrible to women because they're women. Now I kind of see it as like the stream that we all swim in, you know, like where the culture we live in is patriarchal, and so everything we do, unless we're actively trying to not do it, is probably misogynistic in one way or another, which doesn't necessarily mean you're a horrible person, doesn't necessarily mean you're a terrible man, but it does mean that there's some stuff there that we need to kind of define and readjust and evaluate or reevaluate for ourselves. And so I think when we're looking at the backdrop, like statistically for women and girls in our society and trans people as well, right, in our culture and our society at the moment, we know that they're so much more likely to experience domestic violence, sexual violence, so on and so forth. We know that girls in schools are experiencing unwanted sexual touching, that it's more likely that women will have experienced sexual harassment or sexual violence then that they wouldn't have experienced it. And that doesn't mean that every single man is doing all of those things, right? But I think it does mean that for us as men, and especially for us as men speaking to other men and teaching other boys about these kinds of topics, we've got to really approach it from a stance of like all of us are complicit in it. And it's our choice about how we start to undo that, but that undoing does have to happen. So I think, yeah, that it's a sticky term, isn't it? Because I also find that terms like misogyny just mostly piss people off, especially boys, right? They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to be told that they're misogynist. I'm under the impression that most of them are being told that quite often, as it's become more popularized in culture, the same as like the mental health conversation, it's getting thrown around a lot more. So boys are very defensive when that kind of terminology comes up. But I think we have a real opportunity as youth workers, as educators, as parents, as carers to like redefine what that is for those young people. And also in that redefining to like equip them with tools to start to undo it wherever they see it around themselves.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, Ben, and particularly in relation to how young people feel about some of these labels and what it means to them in their context. So one of the things when we were starting to put this panel together and talking to some of the different panelists was we were looking at some of the terms that were being used, and what did they mean and how did young people or workers relate to them, because that's important too. And I think Michael made reference to this, and I know that Pete certainly will later, about as workers, what do we bring to the table when we're engaging in these conversations and this dialogue with young people? And I know one of the things that, or one of the terms that created quite a lot of interest or different conversations with different panelists was the term toxic masculinity. I'm just watching people's faces on the panel so that, because I can gauge the different responses, because to your point, Ben, you know, if young men are experiencing labels and harm as a result of labels that might be being perceived as positive by other people, then as workers we have to really engage with that and explore it a bit more. Michael, I know you've got particularly strong views about the term toxic masculinity in relation to your work. Could you give us a little bit of insight there, please?
Yeah, no, I suppose my dislike of the terms is because, you know, when we very rarely look at the positives of being male, or particularly for young men. You know, what is the positives of being a young man? What are the positives there? So when we hear, and when young men hear these terms like toxic masculinities, and you know, they're looking at it straight away through a label and through a different lens. The lens that they're looking at it through that is, you know, I'm supposed to be toxic. You know, what does toxic mean? It's poison. It's, you know, there's the skull and crossbones type sort of thing. You see the point. So there's nothing there that's positive. So what message are we giving, you know, to young men about masculinities? And then, you know, so that's where I sort of, you know, come at it from this, is that it's, let's start to change the narrative. Let's start to talk, have the conversation. Yes, there is masculinities and masculinity type behaviors out there that aren't good, that are negative, they're not healthy. But what about the positives? Let's start talking about young men in a more positive light. Let them see the positives, you know, within their own lives. Let's start having the conversations, you know, with the young men and talking through these sort of issues. So when we're starting off these conversations, we use lots of activities, lots of games, lots of exercises. Start these conversations with, you know, with young men. And at the very start, 99.9% of when we start these conversations, young men automatically default to that negative, stereotypical notion about what it means to be male. They go down the, you know, the heavy drinker, good at fighting, you know, all these sort of power issues that are there for them. But when we start to think about, you know, the positives and flipping that and turning it, you know, the wee light bulbs start to go on with young men, you know, as well. And, you know, the conversation even there about, misogyny, and, you know, it's negative, you know, and young men think still got, you know, I'm being accused here of hating women, so they shut down. So we need to change that sort of negative. Yeah, we need to actually actively address, you know, the behavior and, you know, how young men treat, speak, you know, and you know, respect and lack of respect, you know, for young women and women in general. So we need, that's all part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. But we can still address it by, you know, looking at the positives and getting the young men to think a wee bit more positively about themselves, about their family, and about their wider male peer group. So that's my rant.
Michael. Thanks, Michael. So I guess the key takeout from that is about language is important. The way that we as workers understand language and use language is important, but also understanding the potential positives and negatives of that with our young people is key, and being able to explore the terms in safe spaces is key, really, being able to talk about it in a way that's safe and appropriate. Okay, Simon, can we just pop the slides on one so that we don't run out of time? So okay, so we're working from a basis that there's really challenging cultural context that young people find themselves in. Ben talked about things like unwanted sexual experiences and harassment that young women face. If anybody's interested specifically in that, there's a great piece of research done by Girl Guides on, and also Plan International, and we can signpost people to those resources after the event. Michael talked about people being brave and honest about their own masculinity and looking at some of those things. So I guess what would be really helpful for people now is to start thinking about people. So as workers, whatever role it is that we're in with young people, and whatever environment we're in, street-based youth work, as Pete talked about, specific identity work, education, what are the kinds of skills or knowledge or competencies that youth workers might need to think about developing if they're going to start to address some of these really tricky topics with young people? Because I guess one of the things that we know is for lots of youth workers, they've not had lots of opportunity in the past few years to engage in CPD. So if people were going to really start to focus in on things, what are some of the kind of things that they might want to focus in on developing? And Pete, I think I'm going to come to you on this one to begin with. What are the points for people that we need to learn?
I think sometimes we ask the wrong question. We spend a lot of time thinking about what works, and it's helpful to think about who works, to think about what kind of person is best placed. And we often spend a lot of time talking about symmetry in social identity. So we need men who come from the same areas, possibly have the same ethnicity or class background. And that there's something in there that we need to unpick, because I think it's true that trying to gain access to some groups of young men might involve the workers having an understanding of the cultural context in which those young men are operating. But there's a danger that we can confuse identification, which is a psychological process. I can see myself in you, with social identity. And I think we've sometimes sort of tended to rely on trying to get older men who perhaps come from the same area, perhaps have the same background, and sometimes have the same attitudes to work with these sort of younger men. And I think we need to be careful about sort of making assumptions about who's best placed, and perhaps we can talk a bit more about that in detail. Two things I would say specifically now: reflexivity, by which I mean being able to think about how you are impacting on the interaction in the moment, and to think about how your identity is impacting on the interaction. And I would also keep a sense of humor and kind of remembering that that's a big factor in the interaction, because this is pretty heavy stuff, right, to talk about. But I think if you lose your sense of humor, that can really hamper your efforts to get your message across. And there's sort of tons more I could say, but I'd start with that.
There's some really interesting things for us to unpick from there. So I guess going to your first point, you were making some interesting observations about representation versus identification, I guess. So there was something, or what I think I heard you talking about was that it's not necessarily about having the same lived experiences as young people that enables you to connect, but it's about being able to understand and pick and empathise. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, I think we need to understand that it's possible for female workers to work with young men, male workers to work with young men. We can identify with parts of people, so we can see parts of ourselves in parts of others. So even though I may not have come from the same background, there'll be some experiences I've had that I can share that will have some extra resonance for young people. I think to perhaps sort of name it more directly, I think youth work has fallen into the trap of charismatic older men who appear to be, and I've sort of written about this, down with the kids, who are able to trade on what I call street social capital, which is a sense of, so in a street environment, and I mean that sort of metaphorically as well as physically, men are competing for status all the time, for sort of man points. And I think trying to enter into that space sometimes means that some workers, some male workers, trade on what they've got in terms of street social capital to gain access, which I can understand why they would do that, because it can feel quite scary to try and access groups of young men in certain contexts. But it's what you do with that access that's really important. And there's some really difficult tensions, and I can give examples of this, where male workers might seem to be condoning or being complicit in sexism or attitudes towards women, and that can be really problematic. But then if you challenge everything that you hear in those contexts, that might mean you can't access. And that's a tension that all youth workers feel all the time. And when you're trying to work with groups, you are going to hear things. And I think this notion of safe spaces is problematic, because I think it probably needs to be called brave spaces. I think when we create safe spaces for young men to talk, what does that really mean? Well, that means we need to let them say what they really think. But when they say what they really think, we have to be prepared to listen to it and hear it. And we have to remember that we might be able to create a safe space for them in a youth club, but they've got to go back to the street environment where being open and vulnerable could really be quite dangerous for them in some contexts. So there's this really difficult tension between what I call empowering young men to disempower themselves, kind of, that if you're asking them to be vulnerable, to let go of their status and their man points in a certain environment, you have to understand that that's serving a purpose. It might be keeping them safe. And so there might be a process, a long process, where sometimes we have to accept that they're going to say and do things that we don't agree with, but we're trying to get beneath that with them. And that can create tensions. And that also means that when you're working in teams, you need to have a really good understanding with the people you're working with, so that there's almost like a process where we can understand that, okay, we've heard that, we'll come back to that. And we're going to choose our moments and pick our battles, because, you know, we can't do everything all at the same time. And that doesn't necessarily mean we are sort of condoning what's being said. So it's those tensions that I think, and that really, I think, do tend to make this work really difficult.
Yeah, there were so many valuable things in what you said. I've tried to capture them so we can hone in. So there was something really interesting that comes back to this idea of freedom of speech, that's really sort of like populist language at the moment, about creating a place where young people can feel able to talk freely, but recognizing that in doing that and in supporting young people to be vulnerable, it might pose risk for them elsewhere. So how do we navigate those tensions? And also there was two other parts to that, which was about, in creating a space for some people to feel safe to talk, it might impact on other humans in that environment and the relationship with that. And also something about colleagues and workers. And I come back to one of the early points that you made about like humour and recognising like where and when we challenge, and the impacts of that on people, particularly in relation to masculinity, and how the impact of challenge might affect those young people. I think that speaks quite a lot to some of the points that Michael was making about like celebrating vulnerabilities, but also recognizing like some of the tensions that can bring. And I'm going to take your point about safe spaces, and I'm going to think about that one, because I think you're absolutely right. What's safe in that particular club between 7 and 8 on a Tuesday, between 8:15 and 8:30 for the minute that young people leave, might not be safe. So I think there's definitely something for us to take there. Ben or Louise, is there anything that you'd like to come back to from Pete's points there about roles, locations, moments? Louise.
I was going to say, do you want to go first, Ben, and then I'll follow up, because
Okay, I've got loads there. I'll keep it succinct. Pete, that was so interesting. I don't know if the term you used was street capital. In my mind, it was street capital, so I'm going with that. But it's such an interesting like idea. And it's like a real tension that we face in our organization. I remember I used to work for another organization, a sex ed organization, and one of the things that I used to hate it there, but it was a really good job to learn like how to do good youth work. My boss used to make us dress in formal wear. I think she used to work in banking actually, and maybe that's why she did it. But she used to make us dress in formal wear to go into these schools. It was based in South London, so into schools with like full of young black kids. And I always used to think this would be so much easier for me if you just let me wear my normal clothes. Like if you just let me wear my trainers, they'll respect me instantly. But I think in that process, like I learned all of the skills to like build rapport and connect, establish like value and establish norms with groups, outside of just how you look and how you position yourself or how you talk. And I think you're right that there are so many skills that exist for us to learn and to practice. Things like critical questioning, right? Like is super, super important. Things like how we use our bodies, what our body language says, how we build rapport, how we show up authentically as ourselves, that makes such a big impact for the young people that we're working with. And I also think like there's this really interesting thing that happens in youth work, in education, like any basically for anybody with kids, there's this weird dynamic that happens where it's like monkey or do it. I was gonna say monkey see, monkey do, but that's not what I mean. It's do as I say, not as I do, right? So like I grew up in a predominantly Caribbean household, a Caribbean family where like hitting kids was very, very normal when I was growing up. And I always as a kid thought it's really weird that like you would hit me if I hit someone at school, and that would be the punishment so that I learn that I'm not supposed to hit someone. And I think sometimes that modeling is maybe the core of like when it comes to skills and what we need to learn or what we need to relearn. I think there are so many things in like how we disrupt those norms, especially if we're talking about men and boys and masculinity and misogyny and patriarchy. There are so many things that are like hardwired into us in terms of just how we manage situations, how we navigate conversations. So things for me like not being punitive, like being collaborative, being really affirming, being open and being honest and asking questions are all things that like when Michael was talking earlier and going through that list of things that like as men we're taught not to do, I don't think any of those things like really fall naturally into like that remit of being a man. So I think actually like really reimagining what that can look like for us as practitioners becomes really, really important. And last point I was going to make was, as an organization, when we do schools work, we work exclusively as teams of men talking to groups of boys, which is like there's been a lot of like conversation internally, a lot of conversation externally over the years about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I do think what you were speaking to earlier was really true, right? About like the emotional labor. Actually, our organization was set up by a group of women who realized that it shouldn't be their job to do that emotional labor with boys for them to learn, right? So they shouldn't have to listen to all the harmful things and like talk from their own experience and try and humanize themselves to this group of boys when men should really be having those conversations with those boys. I'm not saying that's the only way of doing it, but I do think there's something really interesting when you do open up those spaces that are safe in inverted commas about the kind of stuff that comes out that can be really jarring, can be really triggering. We have like women members of staff at schools who sometimes leave the sessions, who sometimes swap out with male staff members, who find it really challenging just to see the boys in that way and to hear all of the things that like usually they say in private or jokes that they make under their breath. And then the process, once those things are out, of like how you navigate them and how you deconstruct them and how you move them towards better conclusions, I think is a whole other things. But I think, yeah, some of those points were really, really interesting. Sorry, Louise, you go.
Thank you, Ben. I'll pick up on a couple of those points. Just before that, I just wanted to say the kind of research that we've done in focus groups and interviews with young men. We've talked a lot about what do you do when you're out in a group? What do you do when you're out in a crowd and people shout at women? You know, would you ever feel that you could intervene? Would you ever kind of call people out? And what we found in our Nottinghamshire research was that there were a lot of young men that felt really uncomfortable when their peers were doing it, and sometimes they would join in themselves. They felt really uncomfortable and they wanted to stop doing it, but they didn't quite know how. So kind of freeze framing that and doing some of the work that I know Beyond Equality are doing is just opening up those kind of spaces to have those conversations and have those honest conversations and try and make people intervene, you know, whatever kind of label we want to give that, or opening up that space to say, hang on a minute, this is just one version of who we need to be. This is one version of masculinity. There are multiple versions out there. There's multiple masculinities. And I think that comes back to a point I think, Ben, you made earlier about the importance of intersectionality and having that in your toolkit. We were talking about skills, knowledge and competencies. So bringing it back to that idea of everybody's identity is intersectional. We've got multiple things that are going on, and there are multiple versions of masculinities and multiple different life experiences that are out there that are inflecting the way that we communicate with one another, the way that we act in public spaces, the way that peer groups will talk about each other. And that kind of awareness of the fact that there's a lot of social pressure, that that uncomfortableness is there to open up those broader conversations. And that just comes back to, again, what Ben's picked up on here, just to expand on this a little bit more. Within the Nottinghamshire research, it was exactly as Ben's just articulated, that women were fed up of being told that either they needed to change their behaviour, or that they had to go around and educate everybody, had to educate men in how not to behave. That narrative doesn't work, and that kind of practice doesn't work. So that idea of having different people to come in and doing that kind of male-to-male peer-led work seemed to be a really, really positive move and a really, really positive thing. And having people embedded within communities like what you've all just been talking about, is really powerful and really quite fundamental. And having those role models there, that's not to say it always has to be men, or it has to fall on the shoulders of, male only youth workers. Misogyny, or whatever label we want to call it, affects everybody. It affects all of us. Everybody is a victim or suffers in one way or another. And if you eradicate these problems, or you look at these problems from the roots, that should make society a better place for all of us. So giving people the tools that we can to do that in the best way possible. There'll be different approaches for different situations, but hopefully that can open up the space to have some of these very, very difficult conversations and make people aware of the fact that they are empowered to change their behaviours, and they can call each other out, and they can, do that from within.
Thank you. There was some really, really key bits of message that came out of all of those things, and I guess I'll just try and summarise them a bit here. We're getting a lot of validation from participants through the chat. People who are talking about how this really echoes their experiences of being a female worker working with young men, or being somebody who's doing detached work. So that's useful to share initially, but also there was something really valuable for me in what we talked about there about cultural norms and cultural sensitivities, and the relationship between the workers knowing themselves and what's useful / what impacts on themselves, and young people. I think you talked, Ben, about in the school situation and about some female staff choosing to leave, and I guess one of the things that I hear with the work that I do with young women is this idea about, we talk about if that person is someone's sister or someone's mum. Well, actually that person is a person in their own right. And so there's something about the human-centered approach and recognizing the individual humans in a room and their culture and their experiences, and using that as a vehicle to connect, that feels really, really important. And something else that's really coming out a lot is this notion of honesty, and I'm hearing that said by all of the panelists in different ways at different times, but about being honest about what we know and what we don't know, and what we might feel, and exposing some of our own vulnerabilities in a way that's sort of safe and is for the benefit of young people, but also recognises some of the things that we might need. Just on this notion of people, before we move into spaces, we've got a specific question that I think it's useful for us to drop in here. We talked about examples of young men being able to be open about the things that they hear and the things that they feel. I think, Ben, you made reference to it in your school example. And the question that's come in says, so as a worker working with young people, when you're hearing the jokes that young people are making or the things that they're saying, how do you strike a balance between, Pete, what you were talking about knowing when to pick your battles, but also making it a safe and quote unquote space for everybody? So how do we move people along to a point of respect, but without either seeming like a nag or closing people down so they don't feel safe to talk about those things in that environment anyway. And I'll open that up to whoever wants to come in on that one.
Excuse me, sorry, I just struggling through. I'll jump in there because I think it ties in again to sort of what we're talking about. And I think it's specifically about, you know, the skills of the worker and the skills that you know that them workers have, and how comfortable they are with engaging with the young men on what's said. So, you know, like it is about, because I suppose we've got to remember, like, there's a process. So sometimes them issues can come up at the very start. At the, you know, there could be in your initial meetings with them, or second or third week. This is what, you know, these jokes or these comments, or, you know, are being said. But I think the skill for me there is about clocking. It's about identifying this. We're taking note of them. It's about rightly saying, right, is this the right time to, you know, to challenge that? Reality is probably not, because them young men, you know, will potentially maybe, you know, leave the group. They mightn't. But it's then about then how you begin to bring that into your session, how you begin to sort of address that as part of the work as you go on with it, and you're integrated in, you know, as part of your session. So you're having, you know, a conversation with the young men about offensive jokes, but again, or offensive comments, whatever it is. But start that, you know, build it into your sessions, have the conversations, start to talk to the young men. Do they see this, you know, as appropriate? You know, where else do they hear these comments? Where else is this, you know, within this group? Is it within their peer group? Is it whenever they're going to, because obviously, you know, the youth group they're with, these young men potentially have other groups that they link into, a school group, a sports team, you know, a rock band, you know, something else. They might be in some other, you know, the different environments. So part of it for me is also understand that ecosystem that the young men live in, and what that looks like for their community as well. But where you can begin to say yourself, this is when I'm going to start to, you know, to address this, when I'm feeling comfortable with doing it, when it's part of the session, and when you're coming up to, you know, to specific sort of, you know, topics as well. You know, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer about when it should be addressed. I think it is about then when you start to address it, when you're sort of saying, right, at some point this has to be addressed as part of this. We need to have the conversation. Do you think this behavior is acceptable within the group? What are the rest is, you know, think is, you know, as well, and open it up. Start them conversations for me, you know, like, what do the peers think? What are their peers think about this as well? Is it one or two? You know, because I suppose for me is that the more you do this work and the more you get involved in it, at some point that consciousness becomes, you know, aware and very prevalent in the lives of the young men. They start to think about, you know, what's right or what's wrong. Are starting to doubt. They've just told a sexist joke there. You know, is that right? No. Do I want people talking like, you know, if that was my sister, if that was my mother, my grandmother, my, you know, my youth worker, if I thought, you know, young men were saying that about them, you know, how does that make you feel? So you're starting to get them to think about it. You're starting to have, you know, the conversations and opening it up. But again, I suppose just the, you know, the skills of the worker. I'm saying to the worker, like, back yourself. You know, you start to know the young man. You know, try things, challenge yourself, push yourself out of your own comfort zones as well. Because, you know, if we don't do that, then you know, what are we doing with them? You know, so we have to get into that sort of way of challenging that behaviour with the young men.
Thanks, Michael. So I guess the key points from that, and then I'll come to you, Pete, are there's something about being brave yourself and being confident, but I think one of the key things that I heard was it's not necessarily about targeting an individual, but talking about it with the collective and creating those spaces where we can talk about a type of behaviour or a type of conversation rather than it being focused in on you, person X said thing Y. So we change a culture and a community as opposed to an individual. Pete, you were going to come in as well there.
Yeah, understanding the function that banter, sometimes we call it banter, don't we, serves for young men in terms of being able to mask their own sort of vulnerability is really important. I think obviously they're using it to be insulting and humiliating women. A lot of the time, though, I think they're trying to protect themselves from being, you know, I mean, I'm sometimes asked, Pete, why are so many young men being so violent towards young women. And if I had 2 seconds, I'd say, well, if you want to make a young man violent, humiliate him. And I think that's the tension that arises. I can tell one story that we came across in our work with our year 9 boys, where, and this is important to understand, that both boys and girls, I mean, Ben made the point earlier about the stream that we all walk in or swim in, that girls can sometimes be part of this issue too. So there was a lad who had been set up by his mates to try and get the snap of a girl, and they all knew that she was going to say no, but they were there filming and they were waiting to film him being rejected. And then once he was, that was then shared on social media. Boys are in their world, they're having those experiences where they are often feeling quite vulnerable at the hands of boys and girls sometimes. And I think my bottom line as a worker was always, I didn't want young men to leave their interactions with me thinking that I agreed with them. And that was something I tried to live by. How you then challenge, and I think there's some interesting questions about whether it's done individually or in a group. I think the presence of an audience creates more possibilities of being humiliated. So individual challenges taken off to the side in a conversation is probably better than picking on an individual in front of everybody. But doing nothing is doing something. That was one of the, some of my principles. If you choose to do nothing, you are still doing something, and you're still sort of communicating a message. So you have to be really strategic about the sort of challenges. But if you do decide not to challenge, it then becomes really important that you're able to talk to your colleagues about why that is and explain why that is, because then people can feel like at odds in a team if you feel, and I think sort of, as a man in particular, if you don't challenge sexism, you need to be clear why in that moment you're not doing that, and have a strategy for trying to work out how to do it with your colleagues. And sometimes that might mean you conceding space to others as well. And the project, I worked with a woman as co-facilitators, and there were definitely moments when we called it dominant voice swap as a context. So there were times when it was strategically wise for me to be dominant in the room and to use some of my power, cultural capital, whatever it would be. But there was times when I really definitely needed to concede that space, and it needed to come from her, the challenge. And I think that process of understanding each other in a team is really, really important. The other one, just one other point I would make, is to work with young people's cultural resources. And we worked with music, and so the messages that they're hearing in music, and they're sometimes sort of repeating, is a good place to start with those attitudes, and to think about how they're kind of expressing their views through their music, perhaps. Just some ideas.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because I guess that we've had a range of different perspectives there. We've got the notion about collective challenge in how we create a sense of shared responsibility and accountability for the way that we work within groups. But then there was also that slightly different perspective, which is about recognizing the vulnerabilities in that for young people sometimes, and that sometimes it might be more appropriate to do the sort of one-to-one sort of like separate conversation. But for you, Pete, the key message that I really heard was doing nothing is complicity, right? It's something that we hear a lot in sort of like anti-racist practice. It's the same kind of principle, isn't it? That if there is no action, we therefore are complicit in agreeing. And there's been some interesting points coming. I am going to come to you, Ben, because I know you had your hand up. Some interesting points coming in about how for some women, or for trans or gay men, it can feel quite different and quite challenging to perhaps be the person who's trying to create that disruption, because of not necessarily feeling a sense of capital or peer or connectivity. So I'd be interested to hear if anybody's got any views on that. I guess just for participants who won't know this yet, for attendees, this webinar is the first of a series of 4, and so we're focusing particularly on young men today, but we have got follow-on workshops that will focus on young women. So the next one is actually what about the girls? We've also got one on gender non-conforming, trans or binary genders, and then there'll be a fourth session as well. So there is opportunity for us to build and grow knowledge across this as well. Ben, did you have something that you wanted to come on to share?
Yeah, I did. I think that this is like that question of like how do you tackle it is such an important question. And I always think it helps to like also bear in mind like what the context is of who we're working with. Because I think for young boys, like often we forget that they are young boys, and we treat them when they make a mistake, we treat them as though they are adult men who have like full reasoning and cognitive ability when they're just not, they're kids, right? And I remember, I feel like empathy is a big part of this because I remember being like 14 and finding South Park absolutely hilarious. I wasn't doing it because my friends were telling me to do it. I genuinely thought this is the funniest thing in the world. So I think like when they're like 14, 15, 16, boys are like still developing empathy, right? They're learning to, if in the best case scenario, they're learning to practice that. They're also experiencing like puberty, so there's hormones, there's all those kinds of things changing. There's lots of peer pressure going around. They're trying to like develop their own personality, like that's different to their caregivers, and they are leaning really heavily into risk-taking behavior. So there's something about making jokes that like sit on the edge that's like really appealing to them, because it means that they are definitely different to the people who are the adults, and they're doing something that's risky, that's dangerous, that like tests the boundaries. And they also haven't developed like an understanding of long-term impacts to behaviors. So they don't, when they're making those jokes, I don't think from the majority of them, they're making them and thinking this is really going to ruin someone's life in the future. They're just thinking this is really funny now and I might get in trouble, but at least everyone will laugh. And so with all of those things taken into account, I always think that like the tools that we try and use is like always being curious. So starting from a position of like genuine, like what is going on here, and commenting on like, I call it the meta narrative, and I know that that's not what it's called, but like commenting on what's actually happening in the room. So like if somebody makes a joke, rather than being like, why did you say that thing, like observing, oh, you made a joke and like 7 people laughed, but some people didn't. This is really awkward. And then like also centering your own emotional response, I find sometimes is really helpful. So whether that's like, oh, that's really weird, or like, oh, I feel uncomfortable, like whatever it is, but just not in a way that's like telling them off, because they're so used to being told off. And often that means that they double down, because it means that they're getting the rewards from like different from caregivers and risk-taking behavior and punishments and all of those kinds of things. So it makes it worse. So I think to avoid that, yeah, curiosity, empathy is really, really big. And then genuine exploration of like why they did, like what was the aim, what was the outcome, what were you trying to get? What do you think the impact is for people in this room? Do you think everyone finds it funny? But it is a really careful line, because I think what was said earlier about like humiliation is like the flip side of the coin. And as soon as it goes there, they just shut down and the conversation's over. So you want to avoid like any kind of like shaming, humiliation, mocking, laughing, trying to make them feel small, and lean like really heavily into genuine curiosity and exploration, I think works really, really well. And allowing them to change their minds, you know, like allowing them to like realize that what they said maybe wasn't as funny as they thought it was, or maybe it does have bad impacts, but they still think it's funny. And then like finding new solutions together of like how they can, because I think ultimately what we're talking about is like in those spaces where we're with the boys, how do we create different cultures, even if it's just for those moments that we're with them? How do we create environments where they're allowed to differentiate, they're allowed to lean somewhere else, and they're not socialized to do that, you know, that they're not socialized to like question things, or you don't learn critical thinking until, if you're lucky, you get to university. They don't teach that in school. So it's like how do we move them into a space where they're practicing that? And I think, yeah, the way is by not punishing them, but just asking questions and being curious, which is really difficult also, just to clarify. I'm not saying that like this is how everybody should treat everybody in everyday life, but I do think in sessions where we're trying to move boys to better conclusions, that's a good way of doing it.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I think that speaks really strongly to the values of youth work, right? Empathy, understanding, curiosity, acceptance, holding people at the heart of our work and relationships is really key. I think there's some really, really interesting and valuable points made in there as well about thinking about like adolescent and neurological development. You know, these are plants growing. These are young people who are just testing things out. I mean, who didn't have I loved black cherry lipstick, and I used to wear a puffball dress, and I really liked bras, right? Not one of those things is a feature of my adult life. And I guess that's an important recognition too, isn't it? Young people are trying on different things when they're with us. And for us as workers to create a space where they can try different things and learn about different reactions and learn in a way that doesn't feel shaming and punitive is really, really, really key. So thank you. I'm going to move us on to the next part, because I think it sits really lovely about this, because we started talking about, well, how do we do that, and how do we create spaces that feel like that, and environments that feel like that with young people. And for all of us, we work in really different environments with young people. We might be in a school and constrained by the boundaries of that. We might be doing work in a community centre in a really specific cultural context, for example, in your work, Michael. And there's also the notion of online. So, you know, as a parent of two boys at opposite ends of the age spectrum, like, they spend far more time online with their peers than they do here. I had boys sleeping over at my house at the weekend that were next to each other on devices, talking to each other in the online space, right, instead of just having a conversation. And so for us, the work that we do has to operate across lots of different spaces. Louise, do you have anything specific that you might want to draw our attention to, and particularly thinking about the online space and the connection with that?
Yeah, I think one of the starting points when we've researched this is looking at what it does to your identity when you're online. So if it is disembodied and you don't have the kind of physical face-to-face communicative resources, things are reduced, and people become more prone to saying things perhaps that they wouldn't say face-to-face. And this is where we're thinking about how, when things go wrong online, bringing back the kind of hate crime, death threats, rape threats, those kind of things that happen and have really exploded in society in a way that just didn't exist probably before the advent of social media in the late, probably the first decade of the 21st century, when social media platforms really started to gain precedence. Because they're so endemic in our lives now, and endemic in the lives of our children. I've got similar experiences to you, Abby, the same preteen son and house full of boys playing Fortnite most of the weekend and shouting at each other on their devices. It does something different in that space, and that kind of sense of not wanting to offend people, or that idea of respect that we were talking about earlier, is very, very different in an online space, and the starting level for it is a lot lower than it is when we're communicating face to face. So in terms of thinking about what happens in those spaces, and again, this is something that's very topical in schools, it's in and out of the news at the moment as well. You know, should children, the government have been talking, haven't they, just before Christmas, about whether they're going to like ban social media for under 16s, and all of these kind of initiatives that they're bandying about at the moment. And I think what we need to do is to teach our young people the skills that they need, and that the online space is, yes, it's online, but it's also it's also your identity as well, and that relationship that you have with peers, whether it's across different groups, or whether it's, you know, kind of talking just to male friends. What's going on in that space has just an impact. And just because you can't see each other, or you're communicating in a different way, doesn't then mean that you're not having the same impact on people, or that level of aggression that sometimes comes out in an online space that wouldn't happen face to face is just as important, and has just an impact, or just a negative impact, as it does in a face to face setting. So the challenges are different, because the idea of those kind of inhibitors are gone, but we normally have face to face. And also, when we communicate online as well, things are open to misinterpretation. So things might potentially get lost because we don't have, you know, the gestures and everything that we have when we are face to face. But in terms of opening up spaces that are positive, you know, you can reach groups, you can reach people in ways that you could never reach before. But of course, the negative of that is that it can affect behavior, and it reduces that capacity to think, well, actually, is that appropriate? Should I have said that? What's going on here? And you can quite easily end up in a space where there are insults flying around and things are permanently written down as a record. That then means that the things that we've been talking about in terms of humiliation can happen on quite a mass scale.
Yeah, thank you, Louise. I think that's a really valuable point about the longevity of the internet, given what we've been talking about young people trying on different things and learning about themselves and others. The internet means that sometimes those things aren't gone.
Yeah, there's that permanent record that's there, isn't it? And it's the same if we think about photographs and videos and images. And, you know, there's a lot of discussion about revenge porn, and been a lot of activity in legal sectors as well about that it opens up a whole set of problems that didn't really exist before, you know, for the explosion of the internet. And things can go wrong and things can go viral very, very rapidly, and you lose control very, very quickly as well. And I think young people struggle to know where to go for help, how to go to help in those kind of environments.
Yeah, I think that's really true. It's much more difficult to contain. My colleagues Zana and Karen actually were talking about an example that you brought when you were talking to them last week about a STEM experiment with young people. I don't know if that would be to do with science and technology.
Yeah, so this is a project that we looked at for the University of Nottingham. It's got a series of science channels that are targeted at A-level students. And what we looked at was what happens when a woman scientist goes into that space, what happens in the below the line comments. So how are these people evaluated? And if you had women scientists and then you added in another protected characteristic, so say they're from an ethnic background, being a woman means that you get subject to negative comments, but then also being from an ethnic minority in the UK means that the negativity absolutely explodes. And there was a very, very common, very prevalent comments that when particular women scientists were doing the experiments, the attention moves totally away from the science or anything that people are learning to how sexually available she is. And this hypersexual environment just explodes. So, you know, bet she gives good blowjobs, all kinds of different ways in which the negativity comes through. And these are online, and these are targeted at students who are, you know, potentially thinking about doing physics, chemistry, biology as, you know, A-levels or at university. And to see that level of negativity in the chat is really, really quite revealing. And it's the scale that it operates on as well. So the person that runs the website, you know, has said that there's not much you can do about this, because when a video goes live, hundreds of thousands of comments come on and they go in and take the worst of these down. But then you're still getting all of these hypersexualized comments, people not being taken seriously in this space as scientists. And I think that comes back to role models and thinking about how we evaluate and judge role models, and then what goes on in that online space. You'd think that the things that are being talked about in that chat would likely never happen in a face-to-face context, but they're there permanently written down for anybody to access and for anybody to see. So the online space is really making that very different.
Yeah, that's I'd love to say that I'm surprised, but actually I'm not. And I guess that's the thing, isn't it? And for those of us working with young people in the online spaces and real world, it's definitely something for us to think about. How do we manage that, and how do we challenge that against all of those things that we've talked about? Pete, I'd be interested to hear whether you've got anything to add there about, we thought about an online space, but what about when we were doing like detached or street-based or outreach work, when you don't have the parameters of a building? What might we need to think about there?
Yeah, I'll come back to that if that's okay. But just in terms of safe spaces, I suppose the first thing I'd say is this brings up the whole question of single sex work, right? Which I know goes back decades in terms of a debate about the value of it. And I just want to raise that really for the group, because we had to make our mind up about that in terms of if we were going to have a mixed group or not. And obviously, if you just work with boys, there's a potential for that to become a quite sexist space where they feel safe to be sexist. But at the same time, by only working with boys, it may mean that they feel safer to be more open. So, and then obviously working with girls who have experiences of sexual violence, that has a whole new dimension that we haven't really talked about. And then even within that, that's quite heteronormative in terms of thinking about it. So there's a lot there to unpick, and I can't go in. But I mean, in terms of creating a safe space, ground rules, having confidentiality is important. Showing your own vulnerability. And I just wanted to raise another question, really. To what extent do we talk about being sexual beings with young people in our conversations? I mean, I'm reminded of a conversation about penetration and me talking about my concerns about a prostate exam. and I'm not sure whether teachers would have felt comfortable with young people. And it's a question for the group as to where are the boundaries. But I think there's something really important about maintaining boundaries, but also being vulnerable with young men and young people so that they feel they can be too, because you're asking them to be. Then maybe we need to think about how vulnerable we can be. As far as the street-based context is concerned, I could talk about this all day, but obviously you don't have control over the space. You're seeking to be invited by young people into the space. So all those issues of power come into really sharp focus. That's why street-based work is so exciting to me, because you can't rely on control of resources or spaces in the same way to impose your power on young people. And so you're always going to be working in a more dialogical way as a result of that, because they can walk away at any point and they may choose to. And it goes back to those strategic decisions about when you choose to challenge, and they become I think all street-based youth work brings these questions into sharp focus, because ultimately, if they don't want to be there, they'll walk out, they'll walk somewhere else. So you've got to negotiate much more in terms of your access and spend more time building relationships, because you can challenge young people and you can say what you've said about earlier about that could be my sister or my mother, but they've got to care about you and care what you think for that to hit home. And that takes time. And one of the problems I would argue with a lot of street-based youth work at the moment is that you've got sessional workers working maybe part-time once or twice a week, and the churn of staff is too fast for people to take the time to build those relationships. And so it ends up being like, it's heading for hotspots as opposed to being somewhere for a length of time in a community so you can build those relationships.
Yeah, there's definitely something really valuable in that, that I think we all can take away, which there's something that I heard across all of what you said, which is about authenticity. And the one thing, I've worked with young people for 25 years, and the one thing that I can say categorically, no matter what environment I've been in, is young people can spot a fake from a mile off. And unless you bring your authentic self to the relationships that you build with young people, none of this work can happen, regardless of whether it's online, in a youth centre, under a skate ramp, wherever you do this work. Without authenticity, we can't build those relationships. And there's definitely something interesting about the sharing and the vulnerability, and what our own boundaries are and what our organisational boundaries are. There's loads of really interesting things to still explore within that, and I will at the end share with people a sort of an online space that people can kind of go on and continue some of these conversations. But I'm conscious of time, and I just want to kind of come to it a couple more points. So we're going to start thinking about practice, which builds on that, and I'm going to come to you to begin with, Michael, because I guess what I'm interested in is we've started to think about some of the do's and don'ts and things that work, but I wanted to ask about your experience of working with young men, because I was particularly interested in this idea about commandments of masculinity that you talked about. What does that mean for people, and what does it mean for young men? And I guess it'd be really great to hear a bit from you about that, and like what does good look like for you in doing this work with young men, and what can people take away with them today?
So, I suppose for me, what does good look like? And I think, it's back, I suppose, what I was saying about, earlier on, and obviously, workers themselves have to take a wee bit of responsibility, themselves for this. And I suppose it's about wanting to have that, it's having an interest in wanting to make a change in young people's lives, but it's also about having an interest in this work and how it is, and immersing themselves a wee bit in it, finding out more, having conversations, reflecting on your own issues as well. And not that sort of bit about what we reflect, even at that sort of, not only having a knowledge of masculinity and masculinities yourself, but also having the knowledge of, Pete was touching this a wee bit, and Ben as well, about their work, is that, the knowledge of them issues that are affecting young men, because they're very, very, very different. Part of the research that we were involved in with the University of Ulster, with Taken Boy Seriously 2 initiative, when part of that research, we were coming right down to, like, there was street masculinities alongside sort of like area masculinities as well. So different issues within different communities and impacting on different young men. So it's having that sort of, that information, that knowledge yourself, and trying to find out what that is as well. We've talked there, quite a bit about, about making yourself vulnerable and creating safe spaces. And, Pete gave a good example there. I remember, young fella saying to me, Mick, do you still have sex with your wife? And I said, well, I have 3 children, so work it out for yourself. He laughed, the group laughed, and it was that wee bit of, you're starting that conversation, and it's a bit about that banter and bravado that happens among men and men's groups, as well. And that's sort of, for me, even how I sort of had that conversation with that group of young men, sort of it eased that conversation sort of, with them a wee bit as well. So, that there's key as well. I also sort of think myself, there's meeting young men where they're at as well, I think is really, really, really important. What I mean by that is that could be a physical space, so it could be in the street, it could be in the local youth club, it could be in the local community house, it could be in a sports hall, wherever that is. But meeting them where they're at in relation to this topic, about looking about men and masculinity and, their own identity, so it's where they're at that particular time, if we have them conversations, right back to what I was saying earlier about language, about, what does it mean to be a young man? Some young men might be very vocal and not have very clear ideas. There might be other young man sitting there going, what the hell, what's he talking about? Jeez, I don't know. But that's where, that comes from for me. So it's just like, being aware, and, the next of the examples Pete was giving there about even street-based work, and maybe working with young men in schools where you don't have enough time. These things and building that relationship can take a bit of time as well to sort of, develop that, so where we can do that. But I think that's vitally important, as well. And I think, the other thing too is about, like, the programs that we're delivering, make them relevant to their lives. Young men tell us, we don't really work in schools. The research that we're involved in would have us in schools, but when young men talk to us about schools and school subjects and study with GCSE, they're saying like, teach me to read, teach me to write, teach me to count, teach me things to get him a job. What am I fucking learning about Macbeth for? And there's all very important things about that, as well. But the programs that we're delivering with them, make them relevant to their lives within their local communities. Is there anything that's specific to their local area that you could be working on, having the conversation with, but getting the buy-in for them. They're saying, this actual program is about me, this is about me improving myself. This is maybe about me improving the community as well. And then, that all leads to a lot of things, such as, them learning other skills and skills development, maybe some leadership opportunities within that group as well, I think, is vitally important. And I suppose one of the things that we do as well, I think we do this well, is we try to bring the local community with us. We would work with our local members and our local member organisations. So we take them staff on the journey with us. We don't come in and work on it, in isolation. We bring, their staff in. Our staff, sit in on the sessions, they sit the plan, we look at the issues, so they're there as well. And then when we're, at that stage where we're saying, look at, because obviously been the voluntary organisation, funding runs out, and different things happen, then, we've left the skills behind. So it's vitally important to do, that, as well. So that's sort of just the wee brief.
I think there was so much in that. I could do another hour on that. I mean, so the key takeaways that just to summarize are, meeting young men where they are at, so taking their knowledge and their experience, their setting, their culture and their context as critical, thinking about the time that you invest and spend in the relationships with them, and bringing the community alongside you, so contextualizing it in things that are important to the young man, which might or might not be Macbeth, depending on what their interest is. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to come to Ben and then Pete and then Louise to say what would be your golden nugget that you would like somebody to take away from this session before we finish.
Are you coming to me first? Oh, my golden nugget. Golden nugget. I think my golden nugget. I'm not sure yet. You have to go to someone else first. I'm so sorry.
I'll jump in, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Pete.
So yeah, a lot of my golden nuggets, unfortunately, sort of rely on a different funding model for youth work than is currently. But for me, training. So somebody needs to have really good conceptual clarity, really clear about their values, and really importantly, see their role as an educator. And certainly in street-based work, that's being lost, in the sense that people are being asked to be crime control as opposed to educators. And I mean, the Karate Kid is a nice one. You know, you've got Mr. Miyagi and the other guy, you know, and thinking about trying to be Mr. Miyagi because there's no such thing as a bad pupil, only a bad teacher, as he famously said. And the final sort of nugget for me would be not off the shelf. I mean, I really worry about resources that are sitting on library shelves, do gender-based work with young people like this. That's not youth work in my view. It needs to be dialogical, and I worry about companies. There's a whole industrial complex being grown up with people saying they can market products which are off the shelf and you can deliver them, and that isn't the model of youth work that I know the MIA is about, or I certainly don't support. So trying to keep that notion of a dialogic practice that is starting where young people are at, as Mike said.
Thanks, Pete. Louise, I'll come to you. Oh, Ben was ready. I'll come to you, Louise, and then I'll come to you, Ben, for the last word.
All right, brilliant. Thank you. I think key message for me is that masculinity isn't singular, it's plural. And the more you start to talk about multiple masculinities and different ways of doing masculinity, the better. And then you can have this kind of conversations that we've opened up today, and opened up those ways of thinking of alternative ways, different ways. And there isn't just this one, you know, you've got to be big, you've got to be brave, you've got to be strong, you know, that point where we started out, I think, with Michael's comments. And I think, and just also the point that we're talking about adolescents, they're trying on different identities. These are identities that they create, but they also co-creating them in groups. And that idea of group and community is fundamental to individual self-perception, but also that idea of group identity as well is one of those really important spaces where things can be discussed. And if you make that space, you know, a good space, and make it not about surveillance, not about telling people off, not about, you know, shouting or saying, well, you can't say that, or you can't do this, you know, having those good, open, honest conversations, then hopefully the individuals and groups can learn from each other in terms of, you know, moving things forward and moving away from the kind of stereotypical attitudes that we've been talking about. So that idea of having those honest spaces, if we don't call them safe spaces, and that idea of group identity emerging is really, really significant. And in my field, there's so much work that's done around adolescence, because it is that fantastic time in identity development where so much work is going on and so much change is going on, that it's, you know, really powerful opportunity. But I'll be quiet there so Ben can come in.
Thanks, Louise. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Louise. My golden nugget, I've got one now. I think that actually I think there are lots of people who are in really difficult positions when they're working with young people. There are lots of us who like teach sex ed, and we didn't get good sex ed when we were in school. You know, like we've literally just figured it all out by ourselves, maybe gone to a training course, and now we're the teacher and we have to educate people on that stuff. And I think with this kind of issue around masculinities and misogyny and gender, I think that's a really similar space where, like, for lots of us, we're still figuring it out in real time. We're trying to teach these kids how to be like good men and good people, and lots of us are still questioning whether we're good men or good people. And I think actually the best investment you can make in terms of like training, in terms of practice, is really doing the deep work on yourself, right? I think is like whatever that looks like for you, whether that's like going to men's retreats and shouting in waterfalls and doing all that kind of stuff. It's not my kind of vibe, but like if that's you, then that's cool. Whether that's like going somewhere around the world and doing a rite of passage, or I don't know, like whatever it is for you. For me, that process was like really being in spaces where I had to listen to women and like understand masculinity from a different perspective to the one that I'd experienced. And I think that is like a really, really valuable tool. It's not to say everything every woman says is right, and it's not to say only women can speak about this kind of stuff, but I do think there's something really important about being in spaces of learning and spaces of like critically analyzing our own relationship to things before we start to teach other people what theirs should be. So I'd say, yeah, that would be my golden nugget, is like, whether that's reading books, watching podcasts, listening to watching films, listening to talks, whatever it is, do some research, do some work, have some conversations, like some really open and honest conversations for yourself and with your own peers, and figure that stuff out. And then more of the other stuff will flow very naturally.
Thank you, all of you, and thank you, Ben, for that nice that really positive ending. On that point that Ben made, there's several points to note. Karen's put in the chat a link to a forum, one of our sort of online spaces that people come together and you can continue this conversation. There's a link as well to the next webinar, the next in the series, What About the Girls, which is thinking about women's experiences and young women's identity development. And we've also got a youth work community practice space in March, which is links to, I think somebody talked about sort of rap and sort of music and the cultural aspects of that, which is about exploring identity, belonging and lyrical content for young musicians on the 20th of March. So once again, thank you to all of the panelists so much. We'll send round some links to some of their work and some of their things that we want to share. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been brilliant. Take care, everyone.